Hollywood can be a cruel, cruel place. Despite your reputation, despite all the amazing films you've made, there's still a chance that your personal passion project won't make it to the big screen. Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, and Guillermo del Toro are just a few of the incredible filmmakers who have had films that never made it into production. And the most frustrating part of all, some of these films seem pretty darn fantastic. Let's take a look at the full list.
Well now, here's a man who wants to get right down to it.
Why not kick things off with one of the grandest uncompleted projects in the history of cinema? You've heard of Stanley Kubrick, right? But despite the many ambitious projects he managed to complete in his lifetime, there was one project that never made it to the big screen, and that would be Napoleon. Kubrick had a great passion for the material and spent decades prepping for the film. Sadly, Rod Steiger's box office bomb Waterloo had just been released. As a result, no studio was willing to take the risk on another expensive historical epic. Kubrick never gave up though. He continued to insist through the years that the project would happen until his passing in 1999. David Lynch is the brilliant, albeit twisted genius behind such cinematic nightmares as Eraserhead, Blue Velvet, and Mulholland Drive. He also co-created a TV show with Mark Frost you kids might be familiar with called Twin Peaks. And if you haven't heard of that one, well, there's not much that we can do for you. Following the release of his debut feature, Lynch intended to direct a film entitled Ronny Rocket. The concept followed a detective seeking out some alternate dimension. He's stalked by donut men. Yes, you heard that right, donut men. And these donut men use the power of electricity to take out their foes. Okay, wait a second. This sounds awesome. How come this hasn't been made yet?
It's none of my business.
Well, it turns out, despite Lynch's desire to make Ronny Rocket, his schedule became so booked up with other projects, he's yet to get around to it. While he's mentioned his desire to see Ronny Rocket through to completion, it doesn't look likely. We've already gotten Oliver Stone's 2004 film Alexander, so you'd think audiences would have had their fill on movies about Alexander the Great, right? Or, maybe they actually wanted to see a good movie about Alexander the Great. Sorry, Oliver, you'll always have Platoon. Apparently, that's exactly what Baz Luhrmann, the director behind Romeo and Juliet and Moulin Rouge, wanted too. Luhrmann's epic tale would star Leonardo DiCaprio. Hey, he's a cool guy, we like him. So why wasn't this made? Well, do you have a spare $150 million lying around? Yeah, neither did studios back in 2003. The project never came to fruition, and the lackluster response to Stone's Alexander only further sealed the film's fate. Just how many Dune movies do we need? David Lynch already took a stab at an adaptation back in 1984 with, interesting results. There was a made-for-TV movie too, and now we have Denis Villeneuve's upcoming adaptation. So much Dune, so little time. But there was one particular attempt at a Dune adaptation that was so notorious it even became the subject of a 2014 documentary. That would be Alejandro Jodorowsky's Dune. Somehow, Jodorowsky even convinced the likes of Orson Welles and the Rolling Stones' Mick Jagger to get involved with the project. Understandably, Jodorowsky's Dune never took flight, but its ill-fated concept still made for one great documentary. Even Martin Scorsese got in on all the fun. His never-produced project was entitled Gershwin. Intended to be an epic biopic of legendary American composer George Gershwin, the film never made it past the script stage. Originally, Paul Schrader, the screenwriter behind another Scorsese classic, Taxi Driver, was attached. Schrader's attempt was massive in every sense of the word, but it was writer John Guare who would end up writing Scorsese's preferred draft. By the time things started rolling along, Warner Brothers had decided they wanted Scorsese to focus on another biopic about singer Dean Martin. They figured it would be a far more lucrative film than Scorsese's passion project. Scorsese continued to insist on doing Gershwin, but Warner Brothers just wasn't having it. Sergio Leone is the famed Italian director behind some of your favorite spaghetti westerns. However, not only did he do westerns, he also made films like Once Upon a Time in America, an epic crime drama set in the early 1900s starring Robert De Niro. It was while finishing up that film that Leone first caught wind of Harris Salisbury's The 900 Days, The Siege of Leningrad. This non-fiction work details one of World War II's most grueling sieges, and Leone wanted to adapt it as his next film. And despite the film's hefty $100 million price tag, it was actually going to get made. The only problem? Leone suffered a fatal heart attack at the age of 60 and was never able to see the project through. Ridley Scott's 2000 film Gladiator ended up being a massive success.
Are you not entertained?
Anyway, Scott wanted to do a sequel that would either follow Maximus' son Lucius, or he wanted to see Maximus brought back to life so he could travel through time and witness major conflicts throughout history, such as World War II. Yeah, it's not hard to wonder why they didn't run with that idea. And while we're on the topic of Ridley Scott films that never saw the light of day, let's talk about Blood Meridian. Cormac McCarthy's classic novel might have worked in prose form, but its relentless graphic violence proved difficult to adapt to the big screen. Scott claimed he had every intention of leaning into the novel's horror elements. This might explain why studios weren't quick to jump on board. While cheap horror movies might be an easy buck, Scott wanted to do something huge and epic. Eventually, he decided to jump ship. You would think a filmmaker like Steven Spielberg could get any project up and running. Following the success of Spielberg's 1977 film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Columbia Pictures was quick to request a sequel. Spielberg opted for an entirely different project. That project was Night Skies, one which would emphasize the more horrific elements of alien abduction. It was loosely based on the real-life case of Kelly Hopkinsville. But despite a script by John Sayles and a potential director in Ron Cobb, Spielberg lost interest in the project, and it never moved past the pre-production phase. Few films have had as complicated and fascinating a production history as Tim Burton's Superman Lives. The film would have starred Nicolas Cage as the Man of Steel and featured a number of villains, including Brainiac, Lex Luthor, and Doomsday. The storyline would take its primary inspiration from the Death of Superman comic book arc. All of this would be filtered through Burton's unique stylings and sensibilities. Honestly, while Burton's aesthetic might work for a character like Batman, we're not so sure he's the right guy to direct a Superman movie. Regardless, filmmaker John Schnepp put together an amazing documentary about this abandoned project entitled The Death of Superman Lives: What Happened. Riding high off the success of his debut feature District 9, director Neil Blomkamp was set for even greater heights. The long-awaited Halo film, based on the popular video game series, had the Lord of the Rings director Peter Jackson as producer and Ex Machina and 28 Days Later screenwriter Alex Garland attached as well. It sounds like a movie fan's dream, right? Well, unfortunately, Microsoft kinda shot themselves in the foot with this one. Their financial demands for the project were far too high. They wanted roughly $10 million up front, plus 15% of the box office earnings. Needless to say, studios had no desire to commit to these insane requirements. Everyone passed, and eventually the project faded away completely. Writer-director Guillermo del Toro has crafted some of the finest films of all time. But despite the fact that he's managed to produce a number of personal projects, there's one he has never been able to get off the ground. And that would be an adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's novella At the Mountains of Madness. While Tom Cruise was interested in starring and James Cameron wanted to produce, studios were less likely to commit to the $150 million budget. Not only that, Del Toro is set on making the film R-rated. This really freaked out potential investors, as there was very little guarantee the movie would end up turning a profit. Show of hands, how many Andrei Tarkovsky fans do we have out there? So, if you're not familiar with his work, Tarkovsky was a Russian filmmaker and arguably one of the most influential. His films include the likes of Stalker and Solaris, which are far too cerebral and slow-paced for mainstream audiences. If you're a film nerd, however, these are absolute masterworks. Tarkovsky always wanted to adapt Fyodor Dostoevsky's literary classic The Idiot to the big screen. Unfortunately, the Russian government wouldn't bite. For some reason, it didn't matter that he'd turned out one masterpiece after another. Regardless, Tarkovsky never stopped pushing, but even he seemed to realize the hopelessness of his scenario. Claire Noto's screenplay for The Tourist serves as a kind of early stab at a Men in Black movie. Only, it's way more twisted and disturbing. Essentially, Manhattan would serve as a home to a secret society of aliens hiding among humans. The project even had H.R. Geiger attached to do design work. This is the guy who designed the legendary Xenomorph from the Alien franchise, as well as the Facehugger, amongst other things. Sadly, the Tourist proved too cerebral and weird for studios to get behind. Eventually, the production faded away. People have been talking about a film adaptation of Neil Gaiman's acclaimed graphic novel The Sandman since the dawn of time. Okay, maybe not the dawn of time, but at least since the series began. The main problem is that Gaiman's sprawling worlds, stories, and characters don't necessarily translate to the big screen. But that didn't stop Roger Avary from trying back in the 90s. Unfortunately, he was dealing with a studio system that just didn't understand the material. Specifically, it was John Peters, the notorious producer behind the botched Superman Lives project, who didn't understand the material. Later on, Joseph Gordon-Levitt would give it a go, only to back away when he couldn't get it right. At the very least, we have the upcoming Netflix series to look forward to. Darren Aronofsky's Batman Year One is a project we still want to see. Aronofsky is the filmmaker behind such mind-bending work as Pi, Requiem for a Dream, and Black Swan, in addition to more grounded, character-driven fare like The Wrestler. Following the abysmal performance of Joel Schumacher's Batman and Robin, Warner Brothers was looking to shake things up with the Batman property. But while Aronofsky's talents would have made for an intriguing final product, it's not much of a surprise that this one didn't take off. There were too many changes from the source material. One of the biggest was the character of Alfred. In Aronofsky's film, he would have been a car mechanic known as Little Al instead of Bruce's faithful butler. While we didn't get Batman Year One, we did end up with Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. Not a bad trade-off, wouldn't you say? When Orson Welles first received the legendary RKO Pictures deal that gave him complete control over his first two films, his original intention was to adapt Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. He had every intention of bringing it to the big screen in the most complicated way possible. The project was deemed near impossible to produce. His intended technical innovations were simply too much for RKO Pictures to handle, and the project was scrapped. Welles opted to do Citizen Kane instead, which, while penned at the time, has since developed a reputation as the greatest film ever made. Quentin Tarantino has long insisted his intention to make Kill Bill Volume 3. He seems to have a couple of ideas for it. One is a story that would follow the bride's daughter seeking revenge on her mother's adversaries. Another would follow Vernita Green, aka Copperhead's daughter, seeking revenge on the bride for taking out her mother all those years ago. The good news is that this one could still potentially happen. The only problem is that he hasn't guaranteed it'll be made at all. And with Tarantino having every intention of retiring from the realm of filmmaking after his 10th film, it's looking less and less likely that this one will make it to the big screen. Francis Ford Coppola has made some of the greatest films of all time. His filmography includes the likes of the Godfather trilogy and Apocalypse Now. You'd think he wouldn't have any trouble making the movies he wants, right? Yeah, not so much. Take his long-abandoned project Megalopolis. His original intention was to make a film about a futuristic New York City. It would be a massive science fiction film with a huge budget. But then 9/11 happened. Suddenly, Coppola didn't think a project so heavily focused on New York City was such a good idea. Nowadays, Coppola isn't completely against the project, but he doesn't seem particularly gung-ho about it either. Its enormous budget, for one, makes the prospect of it ever getting made extremely unlikely. Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense, is the man behind such film classics as Psycho, Vertigo, and North by Northwest. His unproduced project, Kaleidoscope, promised to be one of his most intriguing yet. The film followed a man who lures women to their demise. Hitchcock conceived the project following the financial and critical failure of his 1966 film, Torn Curtain. The film was meant to be disturbing in a way Hitchcock had rarely been before, but the studio talked him out of it. They thought the subject matter was too problematic and would ruin Hitchcock's image.
No, that's okay, Norman.
Hitchcock, so insecure after his experiences with Torn Curtain, unfortunately agreed, and the project was never seen through. I think that we're all in agreement that Mad Max Fury Road is one of the greatest action films ever created. Believe it or not, there was a time when George Miller, the writer-director behind Mad Max, was attached to direct a Justice League movie. Yes, you heard that right, people. This was way back in 2007. They even had a cast lined up that included the likes of DJ Cotrona as Superman and Armie Hammer as Batman. But with the industry suffering from another writer's strike, George Miller's Justice League stalled to the point of non-existence. And alas, we fans are only left to ponder the brilliance that might have been. Now for one of the more baffling entries on this list. Were you aware that Sylvester Stallone, yes, the Sylvester Stallone, wanted to make a biopic about the legendary writer Edgar Allan Poe? Yeah, neither were we, but it's true. Stallone has wanted to direct this one for the past decade or so. He even wrote the script with a particular actor in mind. None other than Mr. Iron Man himself, Robert Downey Jr. There's been no movement on the project lately, and with Downey Jr.'s status as one of the world's most profitable actors, it's looking less and less likely.
I am Iron Man.
Still, we'd be willing to give this one a shot should it ever see the light of day. Director Paul Verhoeven is nothing if not ambitious. His far-reaching aspirations have produced the likes of such classic films as RoboCop, Total Recall, and Starship Troopers. But his project Crusades, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, never made it past the starting line. There were a number of factors in why this was, but the main one was, you guessed it, money. Production was about to kick off, but Verhoeven simply couldn't promise Carolco, the studio behind the film, that he wouldn't go over budget. As a result, Carolco canceled the film. Matching David Cronenberg, the director behind Videodrome and The Fly, with a story like Frankenstein seems like a match made in heaven, right? Cronenberg's body horror sensibilities and striking, unforgettable images seem like the perfect fit for adapting Mary Shelley's influential novel. This one never got past the ideas stage. Producer Pierre David suggested the project to Cronenberg back in the 80s. Cronenberg expressed his interest, and the next thing he knew, there was a full-page ad in Variety announcing the thing. This was the closest the project got to being completed. Cronenberg did suggest where he might take the project, offering that he'd retain Shelley's sympathetic view towards the monster.
So I guess we've saved the best for last.
Filmmaker Werner Herzog has long had an interest in making The Conquest of Mexico. The story would detail Europe's colonization of Mexico from the Aztecs' perspective. As with many of these failed projects, the biggest obstacle was money. Originally, Francis Ford Coppola was on board to produce. But when his film One from the Heart flopped, Coppola failed to secure the $20 million necessary to fund Herzog's project. As a result, the film remained unproduced and was left by the wayside. Phew, that's quite a few movies that never saw the light of day. Which ones do you wish we'd gotten the most? Are there any we missed you think would have been amazing? Let us know in the comments below. And make sure to subscribe to our channel so you can stay up to date on all the great content we're sending out daily.